Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to day 3 Open Remarks, and a big thank you to all our attendees for tuning in to what is definitely going to be the best day of the best symposium we've held yet. So my name is Robert Lutton. I've got a couple of opening remarks to provide for our audience. So it is our thanks to our entire audience that we have been able to grow over 100% of the data leaders and CDOs that have attended Symposium. We actually have collected the demographics and they're actually on our website. So you can actually go to our website and drill down and see the type of companies that attend the Symposium, the different levels of CDOs. I will note that certainly we have got a fair amount of CDOs with the actual title of CDOs, but there's a lot of data leaders out there that still don't have the title of CDOs. So that's something we want to work on and change. And of course, going global, we do appreciate those people that have been up to the wee hours of the morning and provide great content for our attendees. So we thank you all. So one of the questions that we've received in several of the chats, we watch them when we try and respond to them, is how do I do the replay? So what we thought we would do is just take a moment to go through to the actual Whova platform and select this. So let me show you how this works. I'm just going to jump out of my screen for the moment, and I'm going to go into the Whova platform. Now I am in as an attendee, and there is such amazing content that was provided, but I want to go back to day 2. I maybe want to look at a specific track. I'm looking at maybe track 4D. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick any track in D. So this is 2D. It's not the video what I want to watch, but it is in that track D. So I'm going to go into view session, and it should show some kind of option for me. So now here is the option says 7D. That's not the one I want. I want to go up here to the top left-hand corner where I see this 1 of 6. So I'm going to go in and drop this down. Now this will show me all the videos that we've live streamed for day 1 in this track. I'm looking for number 4, which is called Mastering Data. Why Mastering Data? So I'm going to select that, play that. And I believe, hopefully, if I go to section 4 there we go. 4 dot, and I'm just going to pause it there, that I can hide that screen. You can see this, why is mastering data hard? All right, so I just wanted to make sure that you saw me do it live. You can actually go through and drop down this just in case you were confused. That is how you do it. So hopefully this will help. You can click through that. So let's move on. Now, we actually had some people, we had quite a lot of people voting for the best infomercials. If you have not seen them, you saw one of our infomercials just as we opened up, the privacy analytics one. It is sure to get a lot of votes today. We will do some additional prizes at the end of the day. But for the moment, we would like to recognize Databricks, SAP, and Informatica for the best commercials that people voted for so far. And in addition, the people that we have randomly selected to receive a $200 US digital gift card, if you're allowed to receive it, we will send you an email. So the 3 people on the bottom of the screen, and Ambi Ajawa, John, and Reverend Dr. Paul will all receive an email from us with the digital gift card. So we certainly thank you. It just so happens that these people are streaming up their leadership board with the with doing the surveys, with commenting, with posting. So we do watch that leaderboard. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the community leadership board, go ahead and do that. Now, just an FYI, we have a town hall tonight, like we did last year, like we do at most at the end of each event, the symposium. We will also host a town hall meeting at 5:35 Eastern. It will be recorded. We will put the link. We'll make an announcement in the Hoover platform so you can all gather. We'll do it like we did last time, a host webcast where we can see everyone. There'll be no slides. I believe John Talbot will be leading that call this afternoon at 5:35 p.m. Eastern tonight. So be there or be square, as they say. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Rich Wang to introduce the day 3 keynote. Dr. Wang.
Good morning again. CDOs across industries are challenging with maximizing value from data spanning disparate resources, formats, and regulatory jurisdictions. Now, nowhere is truer than in the pharmaceutical and medical industries, where data is highly sensitive, complex, regulated, and siloed. The industry has viewed digital transformation as a massive opportunity to counter productivity headwinds and other operational hurdles. With AI offers great promises towards these objectives, true insights at scale require access to huge amounts of data in consistent and accessible forms, and creating powerful algorithms to analyze the data. And even then, data scientists need to have well-defined questions in order to create meaningful insights. Here to discuss how data-driven digital transformations is changing healthcare are Sarah Lyons, Head of Privacy Analytics and MIT CDOIQ Program Consortium member, and Gabriel Eichler, Vice President and Head of Data at Novartis Data 4.2 program. Sarah, over to you.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Lyons, Head of Privacy Analytics. Many of you may know us as specialists in data anonymization. We're excited to be supporting this MIT CDOIQ Symposium. And I sincerely hope you're gaining insight and inspiration from the many speeches, panels, and workshops. For nearly 18 months, the world has endured a period of unparalleled disruption to our economy, our society, and our way of life. The COVID-19 pandemic has made us realize that everyone's vulnerable. One of the most important sectors, healthcare, has been at the forefront of unimaginable change, and in the case of frontline healthcare workers, heroism. It's all about transformative change. That's why I've decided to do something different with this keynote address. I'm going to be sharing it with someone whose company is on the cutting edge of transformative change. More about Gabriel in a moment. Never before have we as a society and humanity realized the importance of innovation in healthcare and the need for rapid R&D to accelerate treatments and vaccines. Sharing data was critically important to finding our way through this. Public health agencies sharing data, countries sharing data, pharma companies sharing data with each other. Data sharing was and is paramount. There's been a massive shift worldwide in appreciating the need to accelerate R&D. Sharing data, as you know, has played a central role in the success of R&D for treatments, vaccines, and medical devices. In today's keynote, we'll be looking at how data-driven digital transformation is changing healthcare. We all have loved ones, friends, as well as future generations who will continue to depend on and benefit from the field of medicine. And it is data about people that must be used safely and responsibly so that we can put sensitive data assets to work for widespread benefits. Privacy Analytics, along with the entire CDO community, believes strongly in the safe and responsible use of sensitive information. That's what makes transformative change in this industry both challenging and meaningful, and what inspires me to be with you here today. While data sharing can be seen through the lens of a technology challenge, we'll be exploring today how it has increasingly become a challenge involving culture and policy. At Privacy Analytics, we sit at the interface of both these challenges. Many have observed that coming out of this pandemic, we've already shifted culturally. With the new culture, how do we keep the good and improve on what wasn't so great? As with so many of you, we're passionate about building trusted data strategies for innovation that benefits everyone, from healthcare to the environment to public safety and public policy to just about every industry of the future. The underpinning data represent real people, so we need data strategies and solutions that enable us to innovate safely and with confidence in order to realize a future we want and a future the world needs. For these reasons, I'm thrilled for you to meet Dr. Gabriel Eichler. Gabriel is the Vice President of Data for Novartis's Data 42 program. He and his team at Novartis have led digital transformation in the highly regulated pharmaceutical industry with an exciting initiative that may change medicine for all of us. I know you'll be inspired and energized by what he has to say, and I look forward to diving into discussion with him later this hour. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here today and have this opportunity to speak with you and this entire audience. I'm going to be speaking about the frontiers of digital transformation in R&D today. Some of the work we've been doing at Novartis, and more specifically, my program, Data 42. I'm excited to share with you today some of the work we've been doing at the frontiers of digital transformation in drug research and development. This has been an effort ongoing many years, even dating before I joined Novartis 18 months ago. But we'll talk a little bit about that history, where we are and where we're going. First, a bit of the requisite fine print. I won't dwell on this for long. There are many challenges at the core of scientific R&D, and I'm going to speak a little bit about how we face them in the drug and pharmaceutical development industry. It takes an incredible amount of research and work to bring a drug from the bench to the bedside, as we like to say. It can take 10 to 15 years for a drug to be designed and approved as safe and effective. And drugs go through a rigorous process of both preclinical, discovery-related research, as well as clinical trials to develop them through the various phases of clinical testing and demonstration. Not to mention, this whole process is incredibly regulated, as the pharmaceutical industry has a bunch of regulatory and compliance dimensions to it that must be followed throughout the entire process. As we whittle down a set of drugs in the tens of thousands to start, all the way down to one approved therapy by the end of our clinical trial process. Unfortunately, in this industry, we have found a decreased level of productivity. Just 10% of drugs entering the phase 1 clinical trial process ultimately result in an approval. And likewise, it takes over $3 billion at this point to bring a drug from that early stage of research all the way through to clinical trials, especially when you factor in all the failures that come along the way. So we're struggling as an industry to bring breakthrough therapies to the patients that need them. Likewise, we're feeling a lot of price pressure to make sure that we're doing this in the most economic fashion possible, to bring these innovations to the market in a way that they can be brought to patients at a cost-effective fashion, in a way that's not going to make healthcare unaffordable for everyone. Likewise, we know that the challenge is vast. There's over 70,000 different illnesses that plague humanity. And at the rate we've been going for the past 10 years, of developing 40 or 50 new drugs per year, we have a long way to go before we can treat many of the ailments that humanity is dealing with. So when you add in the fact that there's R&D cost pressures, there's this increasing challenge to the probability of success of all these drug programs, we need to find ways of accelerating the time to market, to get through this process more effectively, and ultimately to help improve the patient journeys no matter what illness they have. So we're starting to ask, how can we do this differently, and how can we maybe think about this with data? We shouldn't forget that behind all the data and the technology, though, lies people, patients, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, cousins, and aunts. Across the spectrum, these are people fundamentally that we're trying to serve. And we at Novartis and many across the industry try to never lose sight of the fact that we're doing this for the patients. And that's something we try to bring into the work we do as both an inspiration and a mandate from these populations to serve them with respect and the dignity they deserve. I'm going to speak to you a little bit now about the prospect of digital transformation and how we think about this at Novartis. There's been an incredible amount of hype brewing around artificial intelligence since 2015, when many companies started to make headway in this space, and with the advent of machine learning and deep learning technologies. We've identified roadmaps or ecosystems of hundreds of small entrant startups and medium-sized companies now that are innovating with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Likewise, there's the traditional players across the industry that have been developing pharmaceuticals for decades, oftentimes. And so the question is, how can these two parts of the ecosystem find ways of collaborating in an effective way that allows the best methods to be identified and be brought into close contact with the data and know-how of the pharmaceutical industry to drive innovation in new ways? And we're excited that we've recently understood that over the past 6 years, there's been a 575% increase in the number of partnerships announced between pharmaceutical companies and these AI companies trying to bring innovations and data to the market. We believe that these types of interactions are very, very healthy for the industry and a real opportunity to change how we're doing drug R&D. We're fortunate to have a CEO at Novartis, Vas, who's really helped lead and be visionary in the opportunities that we should see before us with regard to data and analytics. He really has helped us understand that there's an opportunity to reimagine medicine with a digital transformation. Our goal is to invest in technology and the integration of this technology into the R&D approaches that we're bringing to bear every day on the R&D that we're doing. We have extensive data sets that go back tens of years, about 25 years of data in our archives that we can use. And we believe that we can extract from these data unprecedented insights into how we're using our drugs and how we can find the next generation of drugs to bring to patients. Now, our digital journey actually started years ago with some work that was happening around trial management. Novartis operates around 300 trials on an annual basis on a global footprint. So hundreds and hundreds of sites. Each trial has tens of sites, you should note. So thousands of sites across the world. We've had to deploy our research and development teams in order to bring these drugs into clinical research. This is an extremely complicated and costly endeavor, and it's very important for us to have a good understanding of how these trials are operating in the real world. So we established the Nerve Sense system, which allows us to essentially create an air traffic control system for actually managing and observing these trials and investments take root over the course of a global footprint and the course of time. You can see here some screenshots on the left. There are some folks actually sitting in the Nerve Sense bridge, as we call it. And on the right is an example of one of the interfaces which they can use to understand holistically how this R&D effort is proceeding. This, of course, was very foundational to some of the work we were doing during COVID when the global pandemic took root, and we were able to use this tool as a means of understanding exactly how it is that our clinical trials were affected by this pandemic and this change in humanity and society as we saw it. If we take a step deeper into, though, the opportunity with regard to clinical trial data, we could acknowledge the fact that there is a multitude of data about the human experience and human health that we have to understand in order to make drug R&D as digitized as possible. So on the left, you have DNA, and this is fundamental inside every one of our cells that makes us who we are. On the other extreme, on the right, we have the clinical phenotype, or the phenomenon of health and disease that we're trying to understand. And in between, we have successive layers of RNA, proteins, metabolites, cells, and ultimately organs that make the health or disease that we're trying to understand. And so what we're trying to do at this point is to bring together data on each one of these various layers of complexity into one overarching understanding of human health so that we can build drugs and therapies that affect the molecular basis of these diseases and have them in a safe and effective manner make their way all the way into the phenotype and clinical presentation of disease. At Novartis, we recognize that we have an untapped potential of both scientific data and people to bring to bear in this problem. Our medical expertise is profound. We have clinical experts, researchers, chemists, drug development experts, formulation experts, you name it. We have thousands of employees across the company who are working to innovate in what we do with the drug R&D. At the same hand, we have 2 million years of patient data in our archives from the 25 years of drug R&D that we've been investing in. And so the question is, how can we bring together the expertise and the data together to drive and generate the insights we're seeking to understand about human health? And then ultimately, we want to apply this to some very interesting opportunities. How can we use this to simulate virtual trials, to make our trials use historic data rather than control arms or placebo arms of patients that actually have to be enrolled in those trials? How can we have a better understanding of patient cohorts to understand the likelihood of success and the subpopulation of patients that may most benefit from our drugs? And then lastly, how do we think about expanding on the different uses of the therapies that we have already approved through drug repositioning and repurposing? Another opportunity to increase the productivity of what we do at Novartis. All of this, in a sense, is the underpinnings of the concept and strategy behind Data 42. So Data 42 and the grand vision is to think about integrating and aggregating data from across the R&D ecosystem of Novartis and our 25 years of history into a large data lake that brings together harmonized and unified data assets. We pull data from thousands of systems consisting of clinical trial data, molecular data, health system data, and even clinical research and discovery data. All of these data assets come into this one data lake that then gets integrated, unified, and harmonized. We then add analytical tools and applications on top of that, and ultimately a knowledge layer that allows us to understand what we've learned in each one of these experiments and analyses that we've done. We've been doing this with a rich set of stakeholders all around us, including scientific and medical experts, data scientists, data engineers, and app developers, all working hard at building every one of the layers of this process into a seamless single platform. On this journey so far, we've ingested data from over 2,900 clinical trials, representing well over 1 petabyte of data. These come from thousands of systems across Novartis. We've onboarded hundreds of early alpha users into the platform with the goal of reaching over 1,000 users by the end of this year. We've done all this with less than 160 full-time associates that have been working tirelessly at this goal. And we've done it all in less than 3 years. Fundamentally, what we're trying to produce at the bottom of this pyramid is a fair data asset, which allows us to ask meaningful questions that go across our clinical trials. I mentioned to you these come from several systems and system types across Novartis. We bring that into a tech platform which provides for scalable storage, high-performance computing, and powerful data processing and analytics tools. We provide end-user tool sets which allow us to support several different archetypes of users, including both tools for data explorers as well as data scientists. And then lastly, knowledge bases, which allow us to capture and represent the knowledge we've learned through this process and hopefully allow us to share both analytical methodologies as well as scientific insights that have been generated by the use of these data. Through the process of building Data 42, we've had to overcome several challenges and specific ones that I want to talk about with you today. I'll say that several of these are problems that probably are familiar to many of folks in the audience, including inconsistent formats and fragmented landscape of systems that we have to interact with. But to me, some of the most interesting problems to talk about today are actually around managing privacy and data governance, as well as some of the culture and policy hurdles we've had to face and address as we rolled out this platform. The complexity of the technology that we're developing has been incredibly high, especially for us to figure out for the first time, since this is really uncharted territory. What you're seeing here is the flow of data through the entire process of 650 steps that we use to currently process our clinical trial data assets. On the left, you have the integration and sources systems that we pull from on a nightly basis. And then moving across from left to right, you see where we start to structure these data and map these data in our unification and harmonization effort, as well as where we introduce metadata and full verification. At the end of that mapping effort, we've actually introduced over 130,000 mapping rules across these data sets. We then take these data sets and anonymize them using risk-based anonymization. And lastly, we provide these data to our end users in what we call golden records and data objects. This whole process scales tremendously, and we process over 50 billion data points through this pipeline every time we update it. As I mentioned before, some of the most interesting aspects of this are actually around the managing of privacy and data governance. As Novartis has run its clinical trials over the past 20 years, we've gathered informed patient consent from thousands and thousands of patients through that process as is required. Ultimately, though, to determine how we use respectfully and in a consented fashion these data requires us to think about how we apply technology in a post hoc solution manner. Ultimately, this requires us to have an automated solution because, as I said before, the scale of the data is so high and so vast. We also want to think about this to minimize the loss of the data that we have through the process. Now, traditionally, programs like ours may use something called rule-based anonymization, which I like to think about as a sledgehammer. In our case, in our use for the privacy analytics tool, we actually think of it more like a scalpel. In this case, we're able to use an evidence-based statistical approach to maximize the data utility while vastly reducing the re-identifiability of patients. And like I said, this scales, and we apply this regularly to our data set of over 50 billion data points at a time. The policy evolution and cultural hurdles we've had to cross are also quite interesting. There's been a number of challenges that have come, including what is the scope of digital transformation and how do we get the organization to align behind that? Likewise, what are the appropriate and suitable uses of these data? How should we manage access? And what about our compliance requirements in what we learn from these data? Obviously, we're dealing with very private and sensitive information, and the respect of this from a policy, procedures, and technical manner must be upheld. In terms of the cultural hurdles, what's been very interesting for us to see is when people start asking us what happens with their data or their molecule. What happens if we learn something and we have to manage it to ensure compliance? And lastly, how do we upskill the community of our users to make sure they're using these data in a safe and effective manner? This requires us to innovate on our methods and techniques. We're fortunate to have been able to apply these initial applications to several interesting problems. One example of how we've been able to do this is in how we deploy this for the optimization of clinical development. In doing this, we try to improve the development cycle, as I mentioned earlier to you. And it's our expectation that the methods we're developing and demonstrating now will actually have larger implications across the entirety of R&D for a shorter and more responsive trial designs and new applications for existing medicines. And ultimately, this will help us help all of Novartis, all of our patients, and hopefully broad swaths of humanity if we can get this to scale across the Novartis enterprise and the larger industry. When we speak to our initial alpha users, we learned that they're actually seeing some benefits from the platform already. These take many forms, but one of which is that they're finding increased productivity. Oftentimes, the procurement of these data, the normalization and preparation of these data takes 70 or 80% of the time of a data scientist. And the ability that we have to provide these data in a near ready-to-use point-and-click fashion within minutes or hours is transformative to how they think about doing this work and the questions they ask about it. Because of the reusability as well of this platform, we're finding tremendous opportunities to improve the collaboration across the data scientists and users across Novartis. We've enjoyed watching them collaborate on shared projects, on finding and building on each other's work, and this we think is an additional form of value. Lastly, we believe that we're able to succeed or fail faster by doing a lot of simulation work and prediction work using these data so that we're not running clinical trials that would ultimately be fruitless, and we're able to focus on the clinical trials that are most likely to be successful. We're excited to continue to welcome in additional applications, and we're working on these actively, including disease-specific insights and knowledge to understand deeper about the underpinnings of these diseases, how we think about applying rich molecular data to better understand these from a polygenic risk score perspective, to facilitate scientific collaborations with collaborators outside of Novartis who we want to share our data with, to think about improving our preclinical to human predictions so that the mouse experiments that we're running are more likely to be interpreted in a way that helps us understand which drugs will be effective for humans, to better understand the subtypes of a disease or the subgroups of patients that may respond to the drugs that we're providing, to think about synthetic control arms, as I mentioned before, which would use historic control arms or placebos from our clinical trials in our future trials in a way to have less patients receive the standard of care or the placebo. Likewise, we're working on explorations of safety and working on virtual proof of concepts that allow us to build out and scale our enterprise in early phase research, and many more to come. So in conclusion, I believe that challenges at the core of life sciences R&D are that we're seeing tremendous decreases in productivity, and that there's an opportunity to improve this productivity if we start to think about digital transformation. The key success factors to innovation are being able to address the technology, policy, and cultural aspects of this work in a way that unleash our scientific potential with digital innovation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Gabriel. It was incredible to see the complexity and the sheer scale of data that's being managed with the Data 42 program. And I think insightful that you raised some of the challenges beyond the technological change, with culture and policy being key considerations. We hear all the time from data leaders and CDOs that cultural resistance, data literacy, and even policy concerns can be real obstacles to affecting change. Can you share an example of one of the cultural or policy hurdles that you faced on your Data 42 journey?
Great question indeed. So first of all, I will say having the sponsorship of our executive committee and our CEO, and especially having them be so vocal and supporting of this digital transformation, has been fundamental to our success, because they've really cleared the pathway for us and given us a tremendous level of inspiration and alignment across the organization to do these transformative activities. One story that comes to mind in answering your question is really, how do we build the policy about how we make an enterprise-wide data sharing policy come to light? Nobody has ever produced this, and typically the clinical trial data from each one of these 3,000 trials is locked up and essentially kept secret from everybody but the project team that's analyzing the trials. And as a result, we've had to try to find a way to not just share these data with Data 42, but also make them shareable for any of the associates in Novartis to use in a safe and effective manner. And as part of this, we've actually brought together a group of stakeholders across the entire enterprise, from early stage research to late stage development, from patient safety, compliance, regulatory, legal, all these functions together. And we had to sit down for several hours over the course of the year, tens of hours, to craft a policy that would allow us to make a safe and effective use of these drugs, and safe and effective use of these data, and do so in a way that we knew that we would be able to democratize the data, as our goal had always been along the way. And I would say having that broad set of stakeholders, having the executive sponsorship and support, really helped us be successful in being able to do this across Novartis.
That's interesting to hear the cross-functional nature of it. And I think the bridging from data sheltering to data sharing is a challenge that'll resonate for a lot in the audience. You described the need in your presentation to reduce the cycle time to innovate faster with sensitive health data. How did you go about doing that?
That's a good question. It's really been a challenge because we're truly boiling the ocean of data here. The number of transformations that we go through are profound. The amount of steps in that process, as you saw in that slide, 650 steps to useful data. But really what this comes down to is building out data assets and preparing them in a way that our data scientists can consume them and really reduce the time to find them, access them, and use them through that preparation process. And we hope that the 80% of the time that they may spend to find a data asset and to prepare it would then become just a fraction of that time, so they can really get down to using their skills and their knowledge towards the analysis and the insight generation steps, where that's where they would really shine.
Fraction of the time is so powerful. I know you also referenced the verification process you go through with data. Was FAIR something that the organization was already accustomed to, or was that new brought forward with the Data 42 program?
That's a good question. FAIR has been a topic at Data 42, like many data-oriented organizations, for many years now, but it's probably been a little bit more niche. And I think we all know the experience of trying to use a system when you can't find the data, when the data aren't harmonized or aren't appearing consistent across the interface. And we recognize in the data space, especially among the data community of Novartis, how much FAIR had to be a centerpiece of the work we were doing to prepare the data and make it available to these users in a way they can find it and use it readily. So yeah, so FAIR has been a part of Data 42 since the beginning. It's been a part of the data community of Novartis for a while, and increasingly we're hoping that the Novartis community can appreciate the value of FAIR as well.
It's exciting. I had reflected on the context of the pandemic and how many people have observed we've shifted culturally coming out of it. One of the things I found interesting is a lot of what you've done with Data 42 has happened during the course of the global pandemic, where pharma companies were being looked to with hope for solutions. How did the pandemic affect your team as you were launching Data 42?
That's a great question, actually. And I have to say, we've been very fortunate because my team and the team I'm a part of has been on a global footprint since the beginning. So we have many associates sitting here in the United States where I sit. We have many across Europe, many in India, and other countries as well. And I have to say that we've really been quite virtual to begin with. So the fact that we're a digital initiative was great because many folks had to go into laboratories if you're doing wet science, whereas computational science allows you to continue to work at the same pace just with a laptop and access to a cloud computer. And then with the advent of video conferencing and other communication technologies, the shift to virtual was quite limited for us and quite simple, to be honest. And we're proud because we've been able to get a lot done, most of which happened, and the most exciting stuff happened all virtually. I have dozens of colleagues I've actually never even met, not just because they live in foreign countries, but because we haven't even been visiting each other due to the pandemic.
Well, it's a new world, and it was really interesting to see the dashboard of your intelligence of clinical trials operating globally. I know you commented on the importance of the buy-in and sponsorship from the top, and transformative change can really depend on that organizational alignment, both top-down and cross-functional. To what extent was it important to achieve consensus from internal stakeholders to launch and sustain the Data 42 program?
Yeah, it's funny. There is a tremendous amount of support and consensus to the vision. We all know that we can do better using data that we have. We also know it's our responsibility to the community and to the patients we serve to maximize the value we get out of their data. So from that perspective, from a vision standpoint, absolutely, we found great consensus, and that's been critical for us. At the same hand, obviously on the day-to-day, we're wrestling with ideas. There's no shortage of great ideas for how to take this platform to the next level, to add to it, to add data to it, to add technology, to engage with users in different ways. And there we're just constantly doing experiments. We're learning from what works. We're learning where we see value and impact on the use cases that are emerging. And we're hoping actually that increasingly, as we bring in more of these early alpha users and increasingly beta users, we're going to start to see even more innovation on this platform as they teach us what we can do with this platform. It's one of these things that we've created a data asset that never really existed before. And now you can say, what are the things we can do with that data asset that nobody ever imagined before as possible? And so we're looking forward to learning from the community of Novartis and perhaps even beyond our four walls as we contemplate how we can use these data to innovate.
Well, it's exciting to hear about that momentum that can build on itself as you continue to learn. Projecting out as that cycle of learning and discovery and experimentation continues, how do you think Data 42 will change Novartis?
That's a great question. It's something that we ask ourselves all the time. In fact, we ask ourselves fundamentally, what processes, what major business decisions do we think we could actually be regularly valuable at informing through the entire R&D process of that 10 to 12-year process and the hundreds or thousands of decisions and checkpoints that the company goes through for each and every molecule. So we're asking ourselves that right now. How do we better inform which clinical trials we should run, how we should run them, which diseases may be most appropriate for our molecules to go and be tested in, et cetera. And we think that fundamentally, the way to make this impactful is to bring the data and the use case into the existing business processes and start to reimagine them as data-driven processes, rather than sometimes the ad hoc or opinion-based processes that sometimes pervade big industries with so many different decisions to make. So we're trying to make data-driven decision-making a part of how we operate the R&D enterprise and the value chain of pharmaceutical development.
Gabriel, you described harmonizing the data at a scale of billions of different data points and many different data assets. For those outside of the clinical trial space, can you give us a sense of what was actually involved in achieving data harmonization for all these different types of complex data assets?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, that's been one of the cruxes of problems we've had to solve with the technology we're using. So the data standard we're harmonizing to is called STTM at the heart of what we're doing. And STTM has about 3,000 variables we're harmonizing against. Now, we have around 3,000 trials that we are working with. So that at the intersection becomes around 9 million points of harmonization that need to scalably be identified. We've built an in-house process, workflow, and system to essentially take all those data points and make rules that define how those different data sets should be treated and processed as they get into STTM. Now, when you look back at where the data come from, it's 25 years of history. Almost none of that history is actually in this STTM standard today. And it's kind of like if you dig in Rome, you get different layers of civilization as you go back. Well, if you dig in our databases, going deeper, you get different levels of prior data standards that Novartis has used through the years. So as a result, we've had to think about how we build translation layers for each one of those different types of data that have come into the system. Not to mention the fact that we also have acquired data through acquisitions and business development relationships with other companies that we've acquired, either their drugs, their assets, or even entire companies we've bought over the years. So in those cases, we also have to take the data from the standards of those companies and bring it into the STTM process. So really, this is about taking data experts, people who are experts at running clinical trials and understand the data that comes out of them, taking the artifacts that get produced, including metadata, clinical trial protocols, additional annotation documents that may talk about these variables, and then ultimately bringing those all together into the hands of an operator who can go and build the complex sets of rules required to bring these data from these initial standards into a compliant STTM. And so it's been a real challenge, to be honest, but it's been one that we've actually tried to excel at because we know this is fundamental to the success of Data 42.
That sounds like a challenge and really exciting that you were able to find a way through it. You also talked about the anonymization piece to the overall solution and described an evidence-based statistical approach being more like a scalpel than a sledgehammer. Can you share an example of what you're able to get with the evidence-based statistical anonymization that wouldn't have been possible with the sledgehammer rules-based approach that you referenced?
Yeah, so really, anonymization for many years and for many people has been rule-based. And so when we think about this, what we would have to do is remove all dates of service from a record of a patient, all direct or indirect identifying characteristics of that patient through a series of a number of rules that would have to be applied to the data. Unfortunately, though, this would oftentimes remove really critical factors, like exactly how many days were between two visits for a patient who was in a clinical trial, or exactly how old was that patient for a pediatric trial. Those are critical statistics that we have to know in order to fully understand the context of where these data come from and what they're talking about. The beauty of using the risk-based approach is that, first of all, we take a first pass using almost default parameters for the risk-based anonymization. But then what we can do is we can show those data to an end user or an operator and say, hey, are these appropriate for your use? And occasionally they come back to us and say, actually, I'd prefer to preserve one variable, but I'm willing to sacrifice this other variable. And in so doing, we can actually tune the risk-based approach to then preserve what they care for and really remove and make fully anonymized the data that they don't actually care for, allowing us in total to have a much more precise anonymization process that retains far more signal and usability of the data in the end. And that's been a really successful paradigm for us, and one that we're super glad to have had a partner like Privacy Analytics to work with.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Gabriel. And I think also interesting to hear the dynamic with all the different stakeholders involved in this and empowering the user community to really inform how things are done to get to the right result. I'm curious to know, for a program such as Data 42, something this transformative, how you demonstrate ROI over time.
Yeah. ROI to me starts out as having a few compelling stories to tell. It's talking about the stories of how this technology has enabled the business to use data in a different way. So for now, it's about access and engaging with data. It's about figuring out the processes and the problems that we think data can start to solve. Next for us, it's going to be about actually showing stories of where those applications of data have actually resulted in meaningful, tangible insights and outcomes. And we're starting to have those today. I'm just not able to share them in this sort of a setting. So having those stories, though, where you can actually demonstrate a scientific problem, a business problem that was solved rapidly and efficiently using a mature platform like this is the next step on that journey. And then fundamentally, once you have a series of stories, you can try to scale those areas where you've seen success and not do it once or twice, but actually make this part of how the business operates. And that's when you transition to an actual measurable impact in terms of ROI by having repeatable, value-driving innovations at scale for the enterprise. And that was what I was talking about in the talk a bit, is the idea that we can hopefully get to a point where these become part of the process for how Novartis reviews, evaluates, and makes decisions in its regular operations, because we've taken these stories, proven out the methodologies, and now we're applying them at scale. And that's when I think ROI becomes truly applicable. But in the meantime, we believe that the vision we have, the philosophy that we're bringing to the business, and ultimately the initial engagement we're seeing are suggestive of the fact that we're onto a really valuable and exciting new effort. You know, lastly, I'd just like to equate this a bit to how Galileo thinks about looking at the heavens with one of the first telescopes. And ultimately it was the advent of clear glass that allowed Galileo to have unprecedented discoveries about astronomy. And the exciting thing I'd like to think about is actually thinking about how we make data in life sciences become like the clear glass of astronomy in Galileo's time, and how data like this can shed unprecedented insights into the mysteries of the human body and human health.
Well, I love it. It's so exciting to hear and a really insightful reflection on a question that I know comes up for CDOs and data leaders with something this transformative. How do you build momentum and how do you show ROI over time? So thank you for sharing your experience with bringing it down to stories that people can really understand. So I think this might be a great opportunity to now invite our audience to ask any questions that they have.
That'd be wonderful.
Okay, thanks, Sarah and Gabriel. I'm allowed 1 minute comment, and I would like to make that 1 minute comment. This is very incredible, incredible. You provide the flesh into what we have been talking about for the last 10 years or so. And I was on an advisory board for a major pharmaceutical industry. I know how much time it takes to produce a drug. I was also sitting on an Air Force advisory board, and I know how much time it takes for an airplane to produce, maybe 50 years for the life cycle. So it's very important that we combine this process that you started and look out to the space and say, how do we produce the next tier, next generation tool so that we can make it repeatable, reusable, and make it an industry like what Jeff Bezos is working now. And so I hereby, I would like to announce that I would like to start an MIT CDOIQ consortium special interest group on pharmaceutical industry. And I know already another company I can join. So let's flesh this out, bring the whatever is highly confidential. You're not supposed to say anything to an industrial strength process that we can repeat, reuse all the techniques that you have produced, and make it work for the entire world and the entire industry. With that note, let me go on to the questions. So to be fair to, I got more than 15 questions already. So I'll go by sequence. The first question is, what role of data privacy and data security play in data management method to both of you? Whoever can answer the question.
Thank you, Richard. Do you want to start, Sarah, with some of your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think this is incredibly relevant for CDOs and data leaders who need to constantly balance defensive and offensive strategies to protect sensitive data while also driving business value from these data assets. And I think what we've seen increasingly is industry embrace privacy and security by design as a foundational principle, and CDOs play an integral role in bringing these disciplines together so that they're woven in at the forefront of any data management related initiative. I recall we had a CDO roundtable on Monday that really dove into this area of defensive strategies related to privacy and security, where these are integral to data management. They can't be siloed or afterthoughts. And the role of the CDO is so important to bringing all of these disciplines together. So I'd be happy to share that roundtable discussion and the resulting report. But I think the key is that increasingly privacy and security are foundational and integral to managing sensitive data and need to be thought through at the onset of any new initiative, such as Data 42. So maybe Gabriel, you can comment on how you thought about data privacy and security in the context of managing Data 42 data.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, we absolutely recognize from the very beginning how critical this was going to be to make sure that we had data security and data privacy well thought through in our infrastructure and designs, as our policies and processes. So from the very beginning, we recognized the need here. That's when I think we started to reach out to you and Privacy Analytics. And it was from that we were able to grow and understand how risk-based anonymization would be helpful there. We also put a lot of effort and investment into various levels of security across sort of the infrastructure that we're using to ensure the data that we use does not have inappropriate access or application. And so from top to bottom, from the very beginning all the way through to very much this day, we have regular interactions that revolve around ensuring the security and privacy information that we manage.
Good. And as a simple question to Gabriel, can you please briefly tell why is the program named Data 42?
Well, for any qualified geek out there, perhaps you would recognize the Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy reference in the number 42. And you may recall from that book or that movie that 42 really represents, in a sense, the answer that the machine comes up with. And, you know, where we were inspired by this number was the fact that we have to be asking the right questions. We have to be formulating them together to get the right answers. And so the goal here is to answer a lot of questions with tremendous accuracy by asking great questions from a very powerful platform, such as the one we're building, Data 42.
Thank you. The third question, I don't know what's that, but I'll announce it. The 650 steps to usable data. It will be very valuable to the community to understand the steps to bring about large-scale integration. Sarah, it's up to you or to Gabriel.
I think it's to me,
maybe
actually.
A question to Gabriel, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So it's true. What we've done here, I would argue, is leading in the industry in many angles. I think other pharmaceutical companies have begun to take bites at this similar problem, but by and large, Novartis appears to be among the leaders in this space. Those 650 steps were tailored for exactly Novartis's needs and the needs of the data that we also run from other companies where we've acquired over the years. So I would argue that we've learned a lot by this. I would argue those 650 steps likely wouldn't work perfectly out of the box for other organizations, but we are taking steps now that we've begun to industrialize these and really roll them out to start sharing and talking more about these. So we have a channel on medium.com where we're sharing a lot of this progress and a lot of the insights we've had from the cultural, policy, vision standpoint, and increasingly we'll get into the technology and data management dimensions as well.
And that's why I want to invite Gabriel, Sarah, and the CEO of Novartis to come to MIT. That way I can squeeze out their brain for all the knowledge and I will disseminate to the entire community. Next question is a Jeff Bezos question. Did you put in place a process or tool to ensure usability and reproducibility of all these data projects? Sarah or Gabriel.
I think I'll take that one as well. Indeed, we recognize that it's very possible two creative members of our user base may identify similar or even identical problems and applications of these data. So I mentioned in my talk the creation we have of a knowledge repository, the top layer of this pie, if you will. Every time a user goes on the platform or identifies data that they want to use to answer a question, we create what we call an investigation with it. It's sort of a small folder that brings together all the data assets that they've wanted to use. We also ask them to provide details on what question they're trying to answer, what's the method they're going to use, what are they going to do with the answer. And they and their co-investigators then get access to this data in a secure environment. And we like this because we actually can use the annotation that I collected at the beginning as also a way of annotating the project to make it findable later. So this documentation, which we use to authorize the initial access of the data, also becomes the key dimensions for indexing the project and make it findable and accessible to future users who may want to use similar methods, similar data, or ask similar questions that could be built upon the same core infrastructure. So by all means, we want to make the reusability core to what we do.
Good. Welcome to MIT. You now have 42, you have 652, 650. There's another question on 650. How do you support data scientists wanting to integrate their own data with the data they have gone through 650 steps to usable data? I guess that's to Gabriel again, and Sarah, you can comment after that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we have a whole data services group as well, whose job it is occasionally to apply the 650 steps as necessary to make the data brought by a user accessible on the platform and really harmonize with the other assets that we're accessing and using. So from that perspective, absolutely, we have a whole support infrastructure to take the complexity of those 650 steps and help users gain access to those, making them accessible. So that's fundamental because we know we need to meet users where they are, and sometimes they come with data that we simply don't have yet in the platform, or they have applications and innovations that they need to bring their own data to bear there.
Sarah?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, I think this is really a question that Gabriel spoke to well for Data 42, but one of the really, what I found incredibly exciting about the Data 42 initiative is the degree of automation that's been achieved. So when Gabriel zooms out and we see the over 600 steps, we're not talking weeks to data access. We're talking, minutes and seconds. And so this all of a sudden becomes a really practical approach to enabling the user community. So maybe I'll just add that particular aspect of having that built-in automation really playing a role in making this highly achievable and practical for users.
Good, thank you. Question number 6. Much of what you have so clearly described is relevant to the pharma industry overall and not just your company. Is there an initiative underway to let you and competitors share a platform and share costs to tackle common data architecture problems? Hey, this guy anticipated my announcement. Sarah, I think this will be you first, and then Gabriel.
Sure. Well, I'll absolutely let Gabriel comment from a Novartis and Data 42 standpoint. Certainly from a privacy analytics standpoint and the anonymization capability that enables the safe and responsible reuse of data while protecting privacy. This is a generally available capability that supports organizations such as Novartis. And then maybe, Gabriel, you can speak to the broader capabilities that you've assembled in the context of Data 42.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, I will say, I think that there is a emerging sort of dialogue occurring in the industry, which is, we compete on our chemistry, we compete on our ability to bring drugs to patients in clinical trials, we compete on how we bring drugs to market and commercialize them. But should we be competing on digital innovation, or should we be sharing digital innovation with other industry players? And it's for this reason that we've actually been so open in publishing of so many of our methods. We've been publishing aspects on medium.com, as I mentioned. We also have peer review publications coming together now that start to talk a lot about these innovations in Data 42 and in the platform overall. So I would argue that we're not quite there yet on actually processing the data of other companies and sharing physical infrastructure and the cost sharing, but that is certainly part of our vision and our hope that we'll get to that point, that we will be able to open up this infrastructure, share it with others, collaborate on data with others, and do so in a way that advances R&D for everyone.
Okay, good. Question number 7. I'm not sure I understand it. So I'll read it. How do you keep all of the environment evergreen and documented around ownership, transformation, understanding up and downstream effects of changes, execution of retention of data, and right to be forgotten, comma, etc.?
Yeah, so it's true. There's a tremendous amount of complexity when managing data about people, as Sarah and I have spoken about several times now, right? And so what we've tried to do, and the reason why the speed and execution efficiency of our pipelines is so important, is that every time we update those pipelines, we can do a new check on, did the consent status of any of those patients change, that they want to be forgotten? Did even the assets, Novartis sells its assets, its drug assets all the time to other companies. This happens several times a year. So we have to take those data out of the pipeline to make sure that we're not also using data that we no longer have the rights to use. And so these types of compliance at scale dimensions require you to have a swift means of rebuilding and reapplying that logic on the core asset with additional filters and lenses put on there, given how the business needs have changed and evolved. So by all means, this isn't just a build it once and now you have it and now you can ask questions of it. You have to constantly be building and refreshing this so that you're remaining compliant and in accordance with the expectations of what the business needs from the platform.
Thank you. Question number 8, also to Gabriel. What was the first early win in the Data 42 program, and how did you use that to drive adoption across the organization?
So what we're finding now, number one, we kind of expected this, but we're finding that our users come to us with unbelievably interesting applications that we didn't even imagine to ask of the data. So our users are truly the most inspiring source of innovation that we've had the opportunity to work with. And they're starting to ask us questions sometimes that would be unanswerable without this infrastructure, either because it would be months of data prep or finding the rights to access data across numerous clinical trials would be so onerous from a bureaucratic standpoint that it would be impossible to justify doing. So now that we've created the platform, people can ask questions because the data is far more at hand. And one of the wins I can point to quite simply was a clinical trial that was about to be run. And they were trying to determine whether or not we'd be able to find enough patients with a particular set of clinical labs and clinical parameters that would make these patients eligible for this trial. And what we learned when we looked in our database and looked at historic patients and their labs and clinical parameters was that no such population really existed, that very, very few patients actually had this exact configuration of labs and clinical parameters. And thus, attempting to start a trial and all the costs of trial startup would actually likely reduce or result in a totally fruitless trial, which would never enroll the sufficient number of patients it needed.
Okay.
And so for that reason, with a simple distribution and literally a few days of time on thousands of patients, we were able to determine that a particular trial design was going to be fruitless and likely should be avoided. And that saved the company huge money.
I have 9.99 seconds to go. Would you mind sharing the high-level system architecture from source to target, including some tools that you're using? Thank you. I guess
it's a good question. So we integrate a whole series of technologies, some of which I can disclose today, some of which I can't. All of it runs today on AWS, actually. So that's the common infrastructure that from a computing standpoint, this runs on. We run on a Spark architecture, and we run with a series of platforms that we've integrated that are basically best in breed, from semantic management, pipeline management, security, analytics, privacy analytics as one for our anonymization step, and several other tool sets that allow us to bring these technologies together to make the high performance computing and Spark architecture work together seamlessly in the running of these pipelines, the engineering of these pipelines, and ultimately the analysis. So it's been a tremendous technology effort in terms of the lift, but we're really pleased by the way the technologies are coming together and how almost seamlessly they've been made to work at this point.
Okay, I'm going to be hit by a 2x4, but question 10 was the data foundation and golden data assets built iteratively based on use cases or more with a dedicated funding? The last question, and the rest we'll post it, and I assume that Sarah and Gabriel will be happy to answer those questions as well. I guess this is also to Gabriel.
Yes, thank you, and I appreciate the question. So, the golden asset was actually built out of a enormously generous funding from our executive committee. They put a tremendous amount of resources into Data 42. They gave us a 3-year time horizon to deliver on the goals and objectives of this program. And they really gave us the backing we needed to have the assurance of commitment that it takes to build something so transformational. So this wasn't built iteratively from the sense of having multiple users come and ask questions of the data and iterate up the technology. We actually built the technology platform in one big push, of course, in an agile fashion, getting feedback from the user base, from the user community, but really in one big funding push that allowed us to design the soup to nuts technology to come together and solve these problems.
On that note, we have Robert Allen shows up. I'm not guilty.
Yeah, no, you were very, very good, Rich, on that. Rich, on behalf of the symposium, we would certainly like to thank Privacy Analytics and Novartis, Gabriel and Sarah for their time today. We would remind people that if you are interested in learning more about privacy analytics, they do have a sponsor page. They had their session, I believe, yesterday as well. You can review that pre-recording. There are contacts on the session page. It is now 10:03. The next session will begin at 10:15. So enough time to get a coffee refill. But as Rich says, a very good session. And our thanks to Gabriel and Sarah from their respective organizations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was fun.